I was seated in the second row, hands folded in my lap, feet flat on the carpet. The room smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish. Someone had adjusted the microphone too high. It kept catching the echo of the ceiling. I noticed all of that before I noticed him. My uncle cleared his throat at the podium. He didn't look at me at first. He looked past me, over the rows of people who had come to pay their respects, and smiled like this was his room now. "Before we continue," he said, tapping the papers in front of him, "there's a matter of family order we need to clarify." A few heads turned. The funeral director paused near the back wall. The room settled into a listening silence. He finally looked at me then. "There's been some confusion," he continued, voice firm, practiced, "about who belongs where and who doesn't." I stayed where I was, straight-backed, still. He gestured casually with one hand. "You shouldn't be sitting there. That section is for immediate family." The word hung in the air. Immediate. A low murmur rippled through the room. Someone inhaled sharply behind me. I didn't turn. "You were included out of courtesy," he went on, warming to it now. "But that doesn't mean you get a say, or a role, or a place at the front." He smiled again, this time thinner. "Let's not pretend otherwise." I felt the weight of the program in my hands. Heavy paper, cream-colored. My name wasn't printed anywhere on it. "You can move to the back," he said, "or step outside if that's easier." There it was. Spoken clearly, publicly, with witnesses. My aunt nodded along from the front row, lips pressed together in approval. A cousin avoided my eyes entirely. The officiant shifted his stance but said nothing. I didn't respond. Silence stretched. Not awkward, deliberate. My uncle glanced down at his notes, then back up, irritated that I hadn't reacted. "Well," he prompted, "we're waiting." I looked at the casket instead. Polished wood. Closed, final. I adjusted my grip on the folded program, aligning the edges, and remained seated. For a moment, no one moved. The room seemed to hold its breath. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Fine," he said. "Have it your way." He turned back to the microphone, satisfied, as if the matter had been settled. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged. And it stayed that way as the service continued, everyone aware that something had been taken from me, loudly, confidently, and that I had not tried to stop it. My name is Alina Hale. I was 39 years old at the time, living just outside Hartford, where I'd built a quiet, orderly life that didn't depend on anyone in that room. I worked in compliance operations for a regional financial firm, nothing flashy but precise work. Deadlines, documentation, accountability. I was trusted with processes that couldn't afford mistakes. I had arrived at the funeral alone, parked on the far side of the lot, and walked in without announcing myself. I'd done that intentionally. I didn't need attention. I needed to observe. The chapel itself was small but formal. Polished wood. Neutral carpeting. Everything arranged to suggest dignity and restraint. I appreciated that. Environments like that tend to reward people who know how to behave inside them. I'd grown up around this family, but I hadn't lived near them in years. Distance had simplified things. It had also clarified them. By the time of the service, I was no longer woven into their daily narratives or dramas. I existed adjacent to them, not inside them. That distinction mattered more than they understood. I wasn't unemployed. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't confused about where I stood in my own life. I had a mortgage I paid on time, a career that progressed steadily, and a reputation built on being unreactive under pressure. So when my uncle decided, publicly, to redefine my place in the family hierarchy, he wasn't correcting anything real. He was performing, and I let him. My mother's sister had married into the family late. My uncle liked to remind people of that, usually when decisions were being made. What he didn't mention, what he never mentioned, was who stepped in when things actually needed handling. When my grandmother's health began to fail, I was the one who coordinated appointments. I tracked medications. I made sure bills were paid on time and insurance paperwork was filed correctly. I didn't announce any of it. I didn't ask to be thanked. It was simply work that needed to be done, and I was capable of doing it. Later, when my mother's estate required months of sorting, accounts closed, records reconciled, loose ends tied, I handled that too. Quietly, reliably. While others argued over sentimental objects and hypothetical futures, I made sure nothing collapsed in the meantime. No one objected to my presence then. No one questioned whether I belonged. What changed wasn't my role. It was the moment when visibility started to matter more than contribution. Authority, in their minds, belonged to whoever spoke the loudest, claimed the front row, or assumed inheritance as entitlement rather than responsibility. The funeral wasn't about grief for them. It was about reasserting control, about drawing lines in public and daring anyone to challenge them. I didn't challenge it there. Some systems don't correct imbalance immediately. They wait until proof is required. And when they do respond, they do it cleanly. This wasn't new behavior. It only looked dramatic because it was finally happening in public. For years, decisions in my family followed the same pattern. Whoever spoke first assumed authority. Whoever spoke loudest kept it. My uncle had mastered that rhythm early. He filled silence before anyone else could use it. He confused volume with leadership and repetition with truth. No one corrected him. Not because he was right, but because correcting him required effort. And most people preferred the appearance of harmony over the work of order. I learned that early too. At holidays, he decided seating. At gatherings, he decided timing. When conversations shifted toward logistics, money, care, planning, he positioned himself at the center, even when he had no follow-through. Others nodded along, relieved someone was handling it, even when nothing was actually being handled. When things stalled, I stepped in. Quietly. I followed up on emails no one else answered. I confirmed details others assumed. I fixed errors without announcing them. The work moved forward and the story remained his. That arrangement suited everyone, until it didn't. There were moments, small ones, when I could have disrupted the pattern, corrected the record, claimed credit. I chose not to, not out of deference, out of assessment. People who mistake silence for absence tend to overextend. They rely on assumptions. They build confidence on unverified ground. I noticed how often my uncle spoke without documentation, how quickly he dismissed anything that required review, how irritated he became when asked to slow down or confirm details. Those reactions were consistent, predictable, so I let the pattern continue. Restraint, when it's intentional, isn't passivity, it's positioning. By the time he decided to reduce me to a seat in the back row, he believed the structure favored him. He had no reason to think otherwise. He had never checked. And I had never corrected him. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It began with conversations that weren't framed as decisions. My aunt would mention concerns in passing. My mother would ask whether something had been followed up on. Eventually, they stopped asking him and started asking me. Not because they trusted me more in theory, but because things were getting done in practice. When my mother's health declined, the questions became more specific. Account numbers, policy renewals, deadlines. I kept notes, dates, names. I didn't speculate, I verified. There were meetings after that, quiet ones. Kitchens, not conference rooms. Papers spread across tables that weren't meant for paperwork. I remember aligning the edges of a manila folder while my mother spoke, keeping my hands busy so I wouldn't interrupt. She didn't frame it as a request. She framed it as relief. "I need someone steady," she said once. "Someone who doesn't panic." I didn't respond right away. I waited. Silence tends to clarify intent. When she didn't fill it, I nodded. From there, things formalized gradually. An appointment with an advisor, a follow-up with an attorney. Each step introduced deliberately with time in between. No urgency, no drama, just process. I didn't volunteer myself. I answered questions when asked. I reviewed drafts. I flagged inconsistencies. When revisions were made, they reflected accuracy, not preference. There were moments when my uncle was mentioned. His name surfaced the way assumptions do, casually, without analysis. Each time the response was the same. A pause, a redirection. A note added. I watched how often responsibility was confused with visibility, how easily people assumed that being present meant being prepared. By the time the paperwork was finalized, no one announced it. There was no family meeting, no explanation given to those who hadn't been involved. There was only a signature, then another. Then a final confirmation, stamped and dated. Responsibility doesn't always arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it arrives because everyone else has already stepped back. The framework was ordinary. That was the point. Nothing about it was designed to surprise anyone. It followed established procedures, standard safeguards, and timelines that existed long before anyone started posturing for control. The language was neutral, boring even. It described duties, not authority. Obligations, not rewards. I read every page slowly. Not because it was difficult to understand, but because precision matters when responsibility is formalized. Clauses referenced other clauses. Definitions mattered, dates mattered. What wasn't said mattered as much as what was. There were safeguards built in, oversight, reporting requirements, limits. It wasn't power handed over casually. It was responsibility placed where volatility wouldn't interfere. I remember one meeting clearly. A conference room with a long table and chairs that rolled too easily. A glass of water sweating onto a coaster. The attorney paused after explaining a section and asked if there were questions. No one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was evaluative. I asked for clarification on one subsection. Not because I disagreed, but because I wanted the interpretation on record. He answered carefully, made a note, adjusted the wording slightly to remove ambiguity. That adjustment stayed. There was no discussion about family dynamics. No speculation about future conflict. The system didn't care who raised their voice at holidays or who preferred the front row at ceremonies. It accounted only for compliance, timing, and accountability. Once everything was finalized, copies were distributed where required. Originals were filed. Confirmations were issued. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was dramatized. And then life continued. Months passed, then years. The documents didn't change just because people forgot about them. Systems like that don't dissolve due to disinterest. They remain in place, waiting to be referenced when needed. Fairness isn't enforced by emotion. It's enforced by structure. And that structure had been set long before anyone thought to question my place in the room. By the time everything was in place, it no longer felt like preparation. It felt like maintenance. The role I'd accepted wasn't symbolic. It was defined, limited, and specific. Executor, fiduciary, bound by timelines and reporting requirements that didn't flex based on family opinion. The authority wasn't personal. It was conditional, procedural, and already active. I didn't carry copies of the documents with me. I didn't need to. They existed independently of my awareness. Filed, indexed, accessible to the people whose job it was to confirm them. One clause in particular was clear. Control transferred automatically upon death. No vote, no discussion, no interim period where assumptions could fill the gap. The moment was defined in advance, and the response was mandatory. There were also restrictions. Asset access required authorization. Distributions followed schedules. Challenges had windows and thresholds that couldn't be bypassed with indignation or volume. Appeals were possible, but only through formal channels and only after compliance. I understood all of that before I agreed. What I didn't do was announce it. The system didn't require my advocacy to function. It required accuracy, presence, restraint. People like my uncle rely on reaction time, on confusion, on the belief that whoever moves first controls the narrative. This structure didn't reward that. It slowed everything down, forced verification, required patience. Irreversibility wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. Once the trigger occurred, the process advanced whether anyone approved of it or not. Emotion had no standing. Neither did familiarity. I had asked one question early on. What happens if someone objects loudly but formally late? The answer was concise. Then the process continues. That was enough. The lever wasn't hidden because it was secret. It was hidden because no one bothered to look where it had been placed. It existed for legitimate reasons, established by someone who understood exactly how this family operated. When people assume control belongs to whoever claims it first, they rarely check who's been assigned responsibility. They find out later, usually when the room goes quiet. The reading took place 3 days later, in a conference room that smelled faintly of toner and coffee. Neutral walls, no windows. The kind of space designed to keep attention on the table, not the view. I arrived early and took the seat closest to the wall. Not the head, not the center. I set my phone face down beside a legal pad and folded my hands on top of it. The pad was blank. That was intentional. My uncle arrived talking. He filled the room before he sat down, commenting on the inconvenience, the timing, the need to wrap this up quickly. He nodded at me once, curtly, as if our interaction at the funeral had already resolved something. The attorney entered last. She didn't rush. She placed a folder in front of each person, aligning them carefully before sitting. When she looked up, the room quieted without instruction. "We'll begin," she said. Pages were opened. Paper shifted. Someone cleared their throat and then stopped. She started with dates, names, definitions. Her voice was steady, practiced. Each section was introduced, then read, then confirmed. There were pauses between segments, not for discussion, just for accuracy. Silence used as punctuation. I watched my uncle's expression tighten as unfamiliar terms accumulated. He leaned forward, then back, scanning his copy as if speed might produce clarity. Halfway through, he interrupted. "I don't see why we're going through all of this," he said. "We already know how this is supposed to work." The attorney didn't respond immediately. She looked down, adjusted her glasses, and finished the sentence she'd been reading. Only then did she look up. "This is how it works," she said. "As documented," she continued. When my name was read, it wasn't emphasized. It didn't need to be. It appeared in the middle of a paragraph outlining responsibility, not recognition. The effect came from placement, not volume. There was a pause after that section, longer than the others. No one spoke. My uncle shifted in his chair. "That can't be right," he said, quieter now. "There must be some mistake." The attorney turned a page. "It's correct." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I focused on the corner of the table where the laminate had chipped slightly, exposing darker wood beneath. The detail grounded me. Authority doesn't announce itself. It's confirmed. By the time the reading ended, the room felt smaller. He hadn't raised his voice again. He was too busy recalculating. And the silence this time wasn't performative. It was diagnostic. The first reaction was denial. It arrived quickly, almost on cue. "That's not what she wanted," my uncle said, tapping the folder as if the paper itself had offended him. "Everyone knows that. This," he lifted the document slightly, then let it fall back to the table. "This isn't what we discussed as a family." No one responded. The attorney waited. She always did. Silence wasn't a pause for her. It was part of the process. "You must be misreading it," he continued, voice sharpening. "There's no way she would have put this much control in the hands of someone who—" He stopped himself, glanced at me, then looked away. "This doesn't make sense." I didn't react. I kept my hands folded. Still, the attorney slid her chair back a fraction and spoke evenly. "The language is unambiguous. The appointment was made 8 years ago. It was reaffirmed twice. There's no competing document on record." "That's impossible," my aunt said suddenly. She leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "We would have known." The attorney nodded once. "You were not required to." The room shifted at that. Not emotionally, structurally. Chairs creaked. Someone exhaled too loudly. My uncle's confidence, which had been sustained by assumption, began to drain. "So you're saying," he said, slower now, "that she can just, decide everything?" "I'm saying," the attorney replied, "that the executor is obligated to follow the terms as written. Personal preference doesn't factor in." He turned to me then, fully. "You knew about this," he said. "You let us think." I waited a beat before responding, just long enough. "I was appointed," I said. "The process speaks for itself." That was all. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "There has to be a way to contest it." "There is," the attorney said calmly. "Outlined on page 12. The window is limited and the requirements are specific." He flipped pages too fast, fingers clumsy now. Panic doesn't read well. "What happens in the meantime?" he asked. "While this is sorted out," the attorney closed her folder. The sound was precise, final. "The process continues." The words landed harder than anything I could have said. My uncle opened his mouth again, then stopped. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if something internal had finally recalculated. He looked around the table, searching for support, but no one met his eyes. The collapse wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was visible in the way his posture changed, in how he stopped filling silence and started reacting to it. This wasn't punishment, it was consequence, and it had already begun. The first challenge arrived within a week. It wasn't personal, it was procedural. An attorney I'd never met filed a notice questioning the validity of the appointment. The language was formal, careful, and ultimately insufficient. It lacked supporting documentation. It relied on assumed intent rather than recorded decision. By the end of the month, it was dismissed without a hearing. Another attempt followed. This one focused on timing, technicalities, deadlines that, according to their interpretation, should have paused distribution authority. That argument failed as well. The dates didn't support it. They never had. By the end of the first quarter, the challenges slowed. Not because hope remained, but because resources don't stretch indefinitely when outcomes are predictable. Access changed next. Accounts that had once been treated as communal became restricted. Authorizations were required. Requests were reviewed, logged, and approved or denied based on criteria that didn't account for seniority or tone. Automatic withdrawals stopped. Credit extensions expired quietly. I wasn't present for any of those moments. I didn't receive the calls. I didn't attend the meetings where explanations were demanded. I saw only the reports afterward. Numbers, status updates, confirmation notices. By mid-year, the adjustments became visible to others. Invitations declined. Commitments reduced. The confidence that came from assumed backing evaporated when it became clear that nothing moved without oversight. There was one final attempt to reclaim narrative control. A family email circulated, long and emotionally framed, suggesting misunderstanding and reconciliation. It asked for patience. It implied cooperation. It received no formal response. Silence, when maintained consistently, becomes definitive. By the end of the year, the situation had stabilized into something smaller, more contained. The structure held. The terms were followed. There were no dramatic reversals, just gradual contraction. Systems don't retaliate. They proceed. And once they do, they don't look back to see who's struggling to keep up. A year later, the work was mostly complete. Final filings submitted. Reports accepted. Assets settled according to instructions that hadn't changed just because the people involved wished they had. I reviewed the last confirmation in my home office, seated at a desk that faced the window. Morning light. No urgency. I didn't feel relief. Relief implies tension. This had resolved the way it was always going to resolve. Occasionally, I heard updates indirectly. A change of address. A position quietly vacated. Invitations that stopped arriving. Not punishments, adjustments. The kind that happen when access narrows and assumptions are corrected. I never spoke to my uncle again. There was nothing left to clarify. The system had answered every question he'd tried to ask emotionally. It responded in deadlines and denials, not arguments. I closed the file and placed it in storage, labeled and dated. The act was procedural, satisfying in the way accuracy always is. Justice doesn't require confrontation to be complete. It requires alignment between responsibility and authority. What remained afterward was space. Clean, uncomplicated, free of roles I'd never asked for and expectations I'd never agreed to carry. I still attend family functions selectively. I still sit where I choose. No one suggests otherwise now. Not because they understand me better, but because the structure no longer supports confusion. The matter ended the way it should have, quietly and permanently.